Hello there, and welcome to Deep Sea Slumber. Tonight, we descend into dim, sloping water on the far side of a reef, where the light thins and the ocean floor drops away into something older than almost anything we know. There is an animal moving through that water right now. It moves slowly. It has always moved slowly. It carries a shell that spirals inward on itself in a way that feels less like accident and more like intention. A pale, smooth curve, striped in orange and cream, that holds within it a series of sealed rooms. The animal itself is soft. Dozens of slender arms reach forward from the opening of the shell, feeling the water, reading it. The eyes are open but strange, simple, wide, without a lens. They gather light the way a room gathers it through a pinhole in a curtain. Just enough, just barely. This is the Nautilus. It has been here for a very long time. Not this particular animal, but this shape, this form, this way of solving the problem of how to live in the ocean. The Nautilus lineage reaches back through ages of Earth so distant they have no easy names in our minds. Before certain mountain ranges existed, before the continents settled into the arrangements we know. The shell you can hold in your hand in a curiosity shop, coiled, sectioned, quietly beautiful, is the same shell in all its essential logic that moved through seas we cannot imagine. And tonight, somewhere in the warm, dim waters of the Indo-Pacific, a living Nautilus is rising slowly from the depths as darkness comes. That is the thing that takes a moment to fully arrive. Not that the Nautilus is old, not that it is rare, or exotic, or preserved behind glass, but that it is alive, that it is out there right now, adjusting its depth with a system of chambers and gas and fluid that took hundreds of millions of years to arrive at, and that still works, quietly and precisely, in the dark water of a reef slope somewhere in the Coral Sea or the Philippine archipelago. It did not survive by becoming something else. It survived by being exactly what it is. There is something in that worth sitting with. Tonight, we will follow the Nautilus through its world, the spiraling architecture it carries on its back, the strange and patient way it navigates pressure and darkness, the body it has built from designs that predate almost everything we consider familiar. We will travel through deep water and older time, and by the end, something about the shape of a spiral may feel different to you than it did before. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too. One sleepy soul at a time. Now, let your shoulders settle. Not a dramatic drop, just a small release, the kind that happens when you stop holding something you didn't realize you were holding. Let your breath find its own pace, slow and unhurried. The way water moves at depth where there is no wind to push it. We are going somewhere quiet tonight, somewhere that does not ask anything of you. A slope of coral and stone falling away into blue-black water, where the pressure is gentle and steady, and the Nautilus drifts upward in the dark as it has always done, as its ancestors did through seas that are now stone, in oceans that are now desert, across ages that our minds can gesture toward but not truly hold. You don't need to hold anything tonight. Just let the image form slowly, the way dim light forms in a pinhole eye. A spiral shell rising, water that is very old, an animal that has never been in a hurry. Let's begin. If the Nautilus first seems ancient because of its shell, the shell becomes even stranger the longer we stay with it. The shell is not one chamber. It is many, a series of sealed rooms, built one at a time, each one larger than the last, arranged in a spiral that expands outward with a regularity that does not feel accidental. It does not feel accidental because it is not. The spiral of a Nautilus shell follows a precise geometric relationship, one in which each new chamber is proportionally larger than the one before it by a consistent ratio. The curve expands, but its shape stays the same. Mathematicians call this an equiangular spiral. What that means, simply, is that the shell grows without ever changing its proportions. That is a strange thing to sit with. The Nautilus does not plan this. It has no knowledge of geometry. And yet, as it grows, as it secretes new material along the edge of its mantle, it produces a form that can be described with a mathematical equation. The body follows a rule it has never been taught. It follows it because that rule is embedded in the way the animal grows, the rate at which different edges of the shell extend, the angle at which new material is added, the steady repetition of the same proportions at every scale. The math is not imposed on the shell from outside. The math emerges from the biology, from the inside. There is something quiet and almost unnerving about that. We tend to think of mathematics as something invented, something discovered by minds working with symbols. And here is a soft animal in dark water, producing it without thinking at all. Each new chamber is sealed off from the one before it by a wall called a septum. As the Nautilus grows, it moves forward in the shell, secreting a new septum behind itself, closing the old room and beginning to occupy a new, larger one. The living animal is always in the outermost, largest chamber, the newest room, the one it has most recently built. All the chambers behind it are empty of the animal's body. They are sealed. They are preserved. They are the rooms it has already outgrown, left behind in the spiral like a record of every earlier stage of its life. A Nautilus shell, cut in half, reveals this history completely. Each septum curves inward in a smooth arc. Each chamber is a perfect crescent, a sealed space that was once home, now quiet. The chambers near the center are the smallest, the first rooms, built when the Nautilus was young and the shell was new. Moving outward, each one is larger. The animal's whole biography is there, written in calcium carbonate, readable at a glance. No memory is required. The evidence is structural. This is not how most animals carry their past. We carry ours in memory, in the soft tissues of the brain, in the things we have learned and lost and partially kept. The Nautilus carries its past in the architecture of its own body, in a permanent physical record that grows more complete with every chamber added. The shell does not forget. The septa are not flat. Each one is a curved surface, and along the outer wall of the shell, where each septum meets the shell's interior, the junction traces a complex folded line called a suture. In the Nautilus, these sutures are relatively smooth and simple. In the extinct ammonites, distant relatives of the Nautilus, gone now for 66 million years, the sutures became extraordinarily complex, branching into fractal-like patterns that engineers have since studied for what they reveal about structural strength. The ammonites seem to have discovered, over millions of years of evolution, that a folded edge is stronger than a smooth one, more contact surface, more resistance to pressure, a longer line distributing force across a wider area. The Nautilus shell, with its simpler sutures, is still remarkably strong. It can withstand the pressures of significant depth. pressures that would crush structures built by human hands to similar thinness. The shell achieves this not through thickness alone, but through its geometry, the curve, the spiral, the arch of each septum. An arched structure resists compression far better than a flat one. The Nautilus has been building arches unknowingly for hundreds of millions of years. What makes this worth lingering on is not just the engineering, it is the fact that the engineering and the beauty are the same thing. The spiral that looks graceful is graceful because it is structurally sound. The curves that seem decorative are curves because curves resist pressure. There is no separation between form and function here, no aesthetic choice layered over a practical one. The shell is beautiful because it works, and it works in the precise way that it is beautiful. That is rarer than it sounds. Most human-made things that work do not look like this. Most things that look like this were not made to work. The color of the shell follows its own logic. The outer surface is typically cream or white, marked with irregular reddish-brown stripes that wrap around the shell in a pattern unique to each individual. These stripes are not random, though they look it. They are produced by pigment cells in the mantle as the shell is laid down, and they follow the same slow rhythm as the shell's growth, laid down in bands, interrupted by pauses, resumed again. The pattern is, in a quiet way, a record of time. Periods of faster growth, slower growth, interruption, continuation, all of it written in the coloring of the outer surface. The inside of the shell is different, smooth and pale with a faint iridescence. The inner surface is made of a material called nacre, sometimes called mother of pearl, composed of microscopic layers of calcium carbonate arranged in a way that causes light to scatter and shift. The iridescence is not pigment, it is structure. The layers are thin enough that light waves reflecting from different depths interfere with each other, producing color from interference rather than absorption. The shell makes light behave differently than it otherwise would. It does not have a color so much as it produces one, differently depending on the angle, differently depending on the light. Nacre is extraordinarily tough for its weight. The layered structure, which looks under a microscope like stacked tiles, resists cracking by redirecting force along the layers, rather than allowing it to propagate straight through. A crack that would split a uniform material cleanly is deflected, slowed, diffused. Engineers have studied nacre for decades, trying to understand and reproduce what the Nautilus and other mollusks arrived at through evolution. It remains difficult to replicate. The structure is simple in principle and complex in practice, and the Nautilus has been producing it without effort for longer than our species has existed. The shell grows continuously throughout the Nautilus's life, though not at a constant rate. Growth slows in cooler water, slows during periods of limited food, slows as the animal ages. The chambers added in youth tend to be added more quickly. The shell of an old Nautilus may show fine, closely spaced growth lines near its outer edge, where the pace of building has become more measured. This, too, is readable in the shell's surface, if you know what you are looking at. A subtle record of seasons and scarcity, and the gradual quieting of a body that has been building the same structure for decades. A Nautilus can live for more than 20 years. In that time, it builds perhaps 30 chambers, sometimes a few more, each one larger than the last, each one sealed and left behind. The shell it carries at the end of its life contains in its spiral the entire history of its growth, every chamber a year or more of living, every septum a threshold crossed and closed. There is something in that image worth holding for a moment. An animal that carries its own history in a form that cannot be lost, cannot be revised, cannot fade. The chambers do not disappear when the Nautilus moves on from them. They remain sealed and still in the body it carries everywhere it goes. Every depth it descends to, every slope it drifts along, every night it spends rising through dark water, it carries all of it with it in the architecture of the shell. We do not carry our history that way. Ours is softer, more uncertain, more subject to the passage of time and the limits of memory. The Nautilus carries its past in stone, or something very close to stone, something that can be held in a hand centuries after the animal is gone and still read. The spiral continues outward. The chambers accumulate. The animal moves forward into the newest room, the largest room, the room it is still building. And behind it, quiet and sealed and complete, the earlier rooms remain, smaller, older, a record of every version of the animal that came before. The shell does not grow in order to be beautiful. It does not grow in order to demonstrate mathematics, or to teach engineers about structural resilience, or to move people who find it on a beach and hold it to the light. It grows because the animal inside it grows, and the animal inside it grows because it is alive. And being alive means continuing, adding, expanding, moving forward into the next chamber, leaving the last one behind. That the result is this particular spiral, this particular geometry, this particular play of light on layered calcium is not incidental. It is the shape that works. It is the shape that has always worked in the dark water under pressure for a very long time. And it is, quietly, one of the most precise and lovely things the ocean produces. Not despite being functional, because of it. The shell rests in the water. The animal inside it rests in the outermost chamber, the newest room still building. The older chambers are behind it, sealed and still. The spiral holds. The water holds the spiral. And somewhere in the dim slope of the Indo-Pacific, the Nautilus drifts, carrying all of its history with it, in a shape that does not need to be understood to be exactly what it is. And once the shell stops being only a shape and becomes a working instrument, another impossible detail begins to appear. The Nautilus does not swim the way a fish swims. It does not have the dense musculature of a tuna or the long, flexible body of an eel. It is a soft animal inside a heavy stone spiral, and yet it moves through the water column with a kind of effortless precision, rising and sinking through the dark water of the reef slope, as though the question of depth has already been answered. The shell is not fighting against the water. The shell is already in conversation with it. That conversation happens inside the chambers. The shell is divided, as the previous section described, into a long series of sealed rooms. The animal lives only in the outermost, largest chamber, the one open at the front. Behind it, sealed off one by one as the Nautilus grew, are all the earlier chambers, each one smaller than the last, each one a record of a smaller animal that no longer exists. Those chambers are not simply empty. They are not merely the abandoned architecture of a younger body. They are actively, continuously, precisely managed. And the tool the Nautilus uses to manage them is one of the quietest engineering solutions in the animal kingdom. It is called the siphuncle. The siphuncle is a slender cord of living tissue. It runs through every chamber in the shell, passing through a small hole in each internal wall, threading the entire spiral from the animal's body all the way back to the very first and smallest chamber at the coiled tip. It is thin, barely noticeable if you were to look at a cross-section of the shell. And yet, it is the organ that makes the Nautilus's entire way of life possible. Through the siphuncle, the Nautilus can move fluid into and out of its sealed chambers. Not quickly, not dramatically. Over hours, over days, through a process of osmosis and ion transport so slow it is almost impossible to observe directly. The tissue of the siphuncle actively pumps ions, sodium, chloride, out of the fluid inside the chambers. Water follows, drawn by osmotic pressure, seeping through the siphuncle wall and into the bloodstream. As the fluid drains away, it is replaced by gas. Not pumped in from outside, but dissolved out of the animal's own blood, primarily nitrogen, diffusing slowly through the tissue and accumulating in the vacant space. Over time, the chamber fills with gas at a pressure well below that of the surrounding seawater. The room becomes, in the most literal sense, lighter than the water around it. This is how the Nautilus floats. Each sealed chamber is a small pocket of near vacuum held inside stone. The shell, which looks so heavy when you hold one in your hands, is filled with enough low-pressure gas that the entire structure becomes very nearly neutrally buoyant, neither sinking nor rising, simply hovering at depth, requiring almost no muscular effort to stay at whatever level the animal chooses. The soft body inside the outermost chamber is slightly denser than seawater. The gas-filled chambers behind it are slightly less dense. Together, they balance. The animal hangs in the water column the way a thought sometimes hangs in the mind, present, still requiring nothing to maintain it. What makes this remarkable is the precision of it. The Nautilus does not have a swim bladder it can inflate or deflate in seconds, the way a bony fish adjusts its position. The siphuncle process is slow. Moving a meaningful amount of fluid through those chambers takes time, hours at minimum, sometimes much longer. The animal cannot make rapid corrections. It cannot decide to sink quickly and do so. What it can do is maintain a set point over time, calibrating its buoyancy across the rhythm of days rather than moments. In other words, the Nautilus plans ahead. Not consciously, not in the way a person plans, but the slow physics of the siphuncle means that the animal's position in the water column is always the result of something that happened hours earlier. The fluid it moved last night is the reason it is hovering where it is right now. The gas that accumulated while it rested is the engine of its ascent this evening. Its body is always working slightly ahead of its present needs, adjusting for a future that is already on its way. There is something almost meditative about that, a system that does not react but anticipates, a form of balance that is never forced, only gradually achieved. The chambers themselves can hold varying amounts of fluid. A Nautilus that has been living at greater depth for some time may have slightly more fluid retained in its chambers, a small incremental adjustment to the greater pressure of deeper water. As it rises toward shallower depths during its nightly ascent, the balance shifts again. The process is continuous, invisible, and precise enough to keep the animal neutrally buoyant across a range of depths that would crush or rupture the buoyancy systems of many other animals. That pressure question matters enormously. The sealed chambers are under very low internal pressure, far lower than the seawater pressing in from outside. At depth, the differential between the crushing pressure of the water and the near vacuum inside the chambers is significant. The shell must be strong enough to withstand that difference without imploding. And it is. The geometry of the shell, the spiral, the curved walls, the carefully arranged partitions, distributes that stress in the same way that an arch distributes weight. Pressure arrives from all directions and is deflected outward along the curves. The shell holds, but only to a point. There is a depth below which the shell cannot hold. The pressure becomes too great, the differential too extreme, and the structure collapses inward. For most Nautilus species, this limit falls somewhere between roughly 700 and 800 meters. Below that line, the shell fails. The animal dies not from cold or darkness or lack of food, but from the simple physics of a container that was not built to endure that much compression. This gives the Nautilus a world with a floor and a ceiling. The ceiling is the shallows, too warm, too bright, too exposed. The floor is the crushed depth, too much pressure for the shell to survive. Between those two limits is the Nautilus's entire vertical universe, a band of cold, dim water on the outer slopes of reefs and seamounts where the animal has lived, in essentially this form for an almost incomprehensible span of time. The siphuncle, for all its elegance, is also a vulnerability. Because it passes through every chamber wall, it creates a continuous channel between the animal's living tissue and the sealed interior of the shell. If a Nautilus is brought to the surface too quickly, hauled up in a net, for instance, the gas in the chambers expands as the surrounding pressure drops. The shell does not implode at the surface. It holds. But the rapid decompression affects the animal in other ways. The soft tissue of the siphuncle, designed for the slow, patient work of osmosis at depth, is not built for sudden pressure change. Animals brought up quickly rarely survive long. This is one reason the Nautilus remains poorly understood even now. It lives at depths that require careful, slow collection. It does not thrive in standard aquarium conditions. What we know about the sipuncle's function has come partly from careful laboratory work and partly from the physics of the shell itself. From measuring the gas composition inside empty shells, from modeling the osmotic pressures involved, from patient observation of the few living animals that have been maintained successfully in cold, deep tanks. What has emerged from all that careful work is a picture of a system that is, in its own way, almost unbelievably sophisticated, and yet built from principles that are ancient and simple. Osmosis, diffusion, the passive movement of water following ions. These are not exotic mechanisms. They are the same basic tools that cells have been using since the earliest chapters of life on Earth. The Nautilus has simply arranged them over hundreds of millions of years into something that allows a stone spiral to hang in the dark water of a reef slope as though it weighs nothing at all. That is the wonder of it. Not that the Nautilus invented something new, but that it took the most fundamental chemistry of living tissue and built from it a buoyancy system of such quiet precision that the animal can navigate a vertical world measured in hundreds of meters, rising each night and sinking each dawn without a single moment of visible effort. The shell does the work. The siphuncle does the work. The animal simply lives inside the result. There is an old human impulse to separate life from physics, to imagine that living things operate by different rules than the inanimate world. The Nautilus makes that separation difficult to maintain. Its buoyancy is pure physics, pressure differentials, osmotic gradients, gas laws. And yet those physical processes are woven into living tissue, maintained by a living body, serving a living animal that has been rising and sinking through the dark water for longer than most of the creatures we think of as ancient have existed. It is a soft animal managing depth through empty rooms. The rooms are sealed. The rooms are quiet. The rooms hold almost nothing, just a thin residue of gas at low pressure, pressing outward against the stone walls, keeping the whole spiral afloat. And somewhere at the front of all those empty rooms, curled gently inside the one chamber that still has light and warmth and the slow pulse of a living body, the Nautilus continues. Patient, precisely balanced, drifting through the dark as though floating were the easiest thing in the world. Because for the Nautilus, it is. It has been practicing for a very long time. But the shell is only half the surprise, because the animal living inside it carries an older kind of cephalopod body as well. Most people, when they imagine a cephalopod, imagine 8 arms, or perhaps 10. They imagine suckers and the smooth muscular reach of an octopus feeling its way along a rock. The Nautilus has none of that. It has somewhere between 60 and 90 slender appendages arranged in a ring around its mouth, and not one of them is a true tentacle. They are called cirri. Each one is thin as thread and ridged and capable of gripping, but not through suction. There are no suckers anywhere on a Nautilus. The cirri hold by friction and by wrapping, the way fingers curl rather than press. It is a simpler mechanism, and an older one, and it works. That number, 60 to 90, is worth sitting with for a moment. An octopus has 8 arms, a squid has 10. A Nautilus has nearly 10 times that count, and yet the overall impression is not of abundance, but of delicacy. The cirri are thin enough to move in currents. They extend outward from the shell's opening like a fringe, like something between fingers and antenna, sensitive to touch and to the chemical information dissolved in the water around them. They are how the Nautilus knows what is near before it can see anything clearly. They are, in many ways, more important than the eyes. What makes this arrangement interesting is not just the number, but the organization. The cirri are grouped into distinct clusters, some for feeding, some for sensing, some for holding the animal in place against a rock or a surface while it rests. They are not interchangeable. Each group has its role, and the Nautilus coordinates them without what we would recognize as a centralized brain in the way an octopus has one. The nervous system is simpler. The behavior it produces is also simpler, and yet the cirri do what they need to do, reliably, in the dark, at depth, in cold water, in a body plan that has not changed in any dramatic way for hundreds of millions of years. That is worth repeating quietly. The basic arrangement of the Nautilus body, the cirri, the shell, the way the soft parts fit into and extend from the shell's opening, has persisted, with relatively little modification, across a span of time that includes the extinction of the dinosaurs, the formation of the Atlantic Ocean, and several episodes of global ice. Not because it is perfect, but because it has been consistently adequate in the particular world the Nautilus occupies. Adequacy, sustained across deep time, is its own kind of success. At the center of all those cirri, hidden among them, is a beak. It is a true beak, hard and curved, made of chitin. the same material found in insect exoskeletons, in the shells of crabs, in the claws of many ocean creatures. The Nautilus beak is small relative to the animal's overall size, but it is strong enough to crack shell and hard enough to bite through the exoskeleton of a crustacean. It sits at the meeting point of the chiri, at the entrance to the digestive system, and it works like a pair of scissors closing, or more accurately, like a parrot's beak, which is exactly what biologists sometimes compare it to. This is the moment where the Nautilus begins to feel genuinely strange. You have, on one side, a beautifully geometric shell, mathematically proportioned, filled with gas-controlled chambers. You have dozens of delicate thread-like chiri trailing through dark water. And at the center of all that softness and ancient elegance, a hard, efficient, somewhat startling beak. It does not fit the aesthetic. It fits the animal. The Nautilus is not trying to be one thing. It is simply a collection of solutions accumulated over time that happen to work together in the same body. There is something settling about that. The idea that coherence is not required. That a living thing can be made of parts that would seem, at first glance, to belong to different stories, and still be entirely itself. When a Nautilus draws its body back into the shell, it does not simply disappear. It closes a door. The hood is a thick, leathery flap of tissue on the upper surface of the animal's head, or what functions as its head. When the Nautilus retreats, the hood folds up and fits against the shell's opening, sealing the interior from the water outside. It is not a perfect seal, in the way an operculum on a snail is sometimes nearly airtight. But it is substantial enough to protect the soft body from a predator's attention, and it is reinforced with a calcified layer that gives it a stiffness the surrounding tissue does not have. The hood's surface is often patterned, striped or mottled in brown and white, sometimes with a russet band. It is the part of the Nautilus most likely to be seen by anything approaching from outside the shell. In that sense, it functions not only as a door, but as a face. It is what the ocean sees when the Nautilus has decided not to engage with it. Patient and closed and still, waiting for the thing that disturbed it to pass. There is a quality to that image. The hood pulled across the opening, the shell drifting or resting, the animal inside perfectly invisible. That feels almost like the ocean's version of stillness. Not absence, but withdrawal. Not sleep exactly, but a kind of quietness that has a shape and a door and a decision behind it. The eyes of a Nautilus do not have lenses. This is the fact that tends to stop people. Every vertebrate eye you have ever thought about, human, fish, whale, hawk, has a lens. The lens focuses light onto the retina, creating a sharp image. Without it, light arrives from all directions at once, and the image blurs into general brightness and movement. A Nautilus eye is essentially a small, dark chamber with a pupil, an opening, and no lens behind it. Light enters. It falls on the photoreceptive cells at the back of the eye, but nothing bends or focuses it first. The result is an image that is dim and not particularly sharp. The Nautilus can detect light and dark, movement and stillness, the general shape of a large object nearby. It cannot read the fine detail of a surface the way an octopus can, with its extraordinary camera-type eye. It cannot see color the way many reef fish do. What it has is closer to what a pinhole camera produces. A wide field of view, a soft impression of the world, enough information to know whether to move towards something or away from it. This eye design is actually one of the oldest in the animal kingdom. Compound eyes, camera eyes, and pinhole eyes all appear in different branches of life, and the Nautilus pinhole is among the more ancient variants still in use. It has not been replaced by a lens over the hundreds of millions of years the Nautilus lineage has persisted. That might seem like an oversight. Lenses are clearly useful, and many animals have evolved them independently. But the Nautilus does not hunt by sight. It hunts by scent and by touch. The eye tells it something. It does not need to tell it everything. And here is where the wonder pivots, quietly. The Nautilus is not failing to have better eyes. It is succeeding with the eyes it has, in a world where chemical information and tactile sensitivity have always mattered more than visual acuity. Sharp sight costs something, metabolically, developmentally, in terms of the neural architecture required to process a detailed image. The Nautilus has not paid that cost, and it has not needed to. It lives in dim water, hunting by gradient and touch, and its soft impression of the surrounding world is enough to navigate a life that has persisted in essentially this form since before there were fish in the sea. What we call a limitation is often just a different answer to the same question. The pupil of the Nautilus eye can change size. In brighter water, it constricts. In darkness, it opens wider, trying to gather more of the available light. This is a familiar reflex. Human pupils do the same thing, and so do the pupils of most animals with eyes that respond to light. But in a Nautilus, with no lens to focus what comes through, the pupil adjustment changes the quality of the image in a slightly different way than it does in a camera-type eye. A wider pupil in a pinhole camera makes the image brighter but softer. A narrower one makes it dimmer but marginally clearer. The Nautilus is always trading one quality for another. This is, in some sense, what all eyes do. There is no perfect eye, only eyes that are well suited to particular conditions and particular needs. The Nautilus eye is well suited to the middle depths of a reef slope, where light is diffuse and distant, where the most important information arrives not as an image, but as a scent trail or a pressure change in the water. The eye confirms what the Chirae have already begun to suggest. It fills in the general shape of a world the animal already knows by other means. That is a different relationship with vision than most of us have. To use sight, not as the primary sense, but as a kind of confirmation. To know the world first by touch and chemistry, and then, softly, dimly, by light. All of this, the Chirae, the beak, the hood, the pinhole eye, belongs to a body that is itself soft. The Nautilus has no internal shell, no cartilaginous support structure of the kind that stiffens a squid's mantle. The living tissue is entirely contained and supported by the external shell. Outside the shell, it is vulnerable in a way that an octopus, for all its softness, is not, because an octopus can move, can jet away, can change color and texture and squeeze through an impossible gap. The Nautilus cannot do most of those things. It withdraws. It closes its door. It waits. The body plan it carries is not the body plan of an animal that outruns danger or outsmarts it in the quick, flexible way of a modern cephalopod. It is the body plan of an animal that endures. That is patient in a way that goes beyond behavior into structure itself. The shell is patience made physical. The hood is patience with a face. The Chirae extending slowly into dark water, are patience sensing the world one chemical trace at a time. And the eyes, those soft, unfocused, ancient eyes, are patience looking out at whatever the dim water offers, asking not for sharpness, but for enough. Just enough to know which way to drift. Just enough to know when to close the door and wait for the world to settle again. The Nautilus does not need to see clearly to know where it is. It has other ways of knowing. It has always had other ways of knowing, and they have been sufficient for longer than most kinds of knowing have existed. That is a quiet thing to carry, and the Nautilus carries it without effort, without awareness that it is remarkable, drifting through the dark water of the reef slope, its cirri trailing, its shell behind it, its ancient eyes open to whatever light remains. All of these improbable features matter because they place the Nautilus in a very particular world, one arranged above and below rather than left and right. Most of us think of the ocean as a horizontal place. We imagine swimming outward toward open water, away from shore. But for the Nautilus, the ocean is primarily vertical. Its world is measured in depth. Every significant thing that happens to it, where it sleeps, where it hunts, how warm or cold it is, how much pressure presses against the shell, is determined not by how far it has traveled along the seafloor, but by how far it has risen or descended through the water column. The reef slope is where this vertical world becomes visible. Coral reefs do not simply end at some point and give way to open sea. Many of them drop. The shallow, sunlit shelf, bright with coral and fish and warm water, reaches some edge and then falls steeply away. Not a gradual slope in all cases, but sometimes something closer to a cliff. Light follows that drop for a while, then thins, then fades. The water cools, the pressure rises, and the community of animals changes completely as you descend, from the quick and colourful species of the shallows to something quieter, more sparse, more patient. The Nautilus lives in that lower register, not in the shallows, not in the deep abyss. In the middle slope, where the light has gone dim and the water has gone cold. They are found most often between roughly 150 and 300 meters down. That is the heart of their range. But they are capable of moving between around 50 meters and something approaching 700 or 800 meters, depending on the individual and the conditions. What matters is that they do not wander freely across this entire range. They move within it carefully, and the boundaries are not arbitrary. The boundaries are set by physics. Pressure is the first constraint. Water weighs something, and the deeper you go, the more water is stacked above you. Every 10 meters of descent adds roughly 1 additional atmosphere of pressure. At 300 meters, the pressure is about 30 times what it is at the surface. The Nautilus's shell can withstand this. It is a precision structure, the kind of thing that engineers study. But it is not infinitely strong. Go deep enough and the shell will implode, crushed inward by pressure that the chambers can no longer contain. The Nautilus does not know this in any conscious sense, but it behaves as though it knows. It does not descend beyond a certain depth. Its body, shaped by long selection, has learned the limit. The second constraint is temperature. The Nautilus is what biologists call a stenothermal animal, one with a narrow tolerance for temperature change. The water in its preferred depth range is typically between about 10 and 20 degrees Celsius. Warmer than that, and its metabolism begins to run faster than its physiology can sustain. The Nautilus cannot cool itself. It has no mechanism for regulating its internal temperature the way a mammal can. It is the water's temperature entirely. So if warm water pushes down from the surface during certain seasons or certain conditions, the Nautilus moves deeper, following the cold. And if cold water rises unexpectedly, it may move shallower. The whole vertical rhythm of its life is, in part, a search for water that is the right temperature. What makes this worth sitting with is what it reveals about the Nautilus's relationship with its environment. It is not simply living in the ocean. It is living inside a very specific band of conditions that the ocean offers, and it is navigating that band constantly, carefully, without any apparent effort. The shell handles the pressure, the behavior handles the temperature, and together they keep the animal in the one narrow corridor where it can survive. That corridor is dark, not completely dark. At 150 or 200 meters, a small amount of light still filters down from above. It is a dim blue-gray, enough to suggest the presence of objects, but not enough to illuminate them clearly. By 300 meters, even that is nearly gone. The Nautilus, with its pinhole eyes and its ancient design, is not disadvantaged by this in the way that a human would be. Its eyes are suited to detecting motion and changes in light level, not to resolving fine detail. In the dim water of the reef slope, the gradients of light matter more than edges and shapes. The animal is reading the water rather than seeing through it. And in that kind of reading, the dim light is enough. The reef slope itself is a landscape of its own. It is not featureless. Coral still grows on the upper portions, though it changes character, less branching, more plate-like, the colonies spreading horizontally to catch whatever light reaches them. Sponges become more common. Crevices open in the rock. The sea floor at these depths is often a mixture of coral rubble, sediment and exposed stone, and the slope is riddled with places where an animal the size of a nautilus could rest, press itself into shadow, and wait. This is important. The Nautilus is not a fast swimmer. It is not built for open water pursuit. It needs a landscape that offers cover, and the reef slope provides it. Not in the way that a shallow reef provides cover, with its riot of coral and fish and movement, but in the quieter way of depth. Stillness is the shelter here. The Nautilus rises at night. This is one of the most consistent things known about its behavior, and it will be explored in more detail later in this video. But it is worth noting here, in the context of the vertical world, that the nightly ascent is not simply a matter of preference. It is a response to a cascade of changes. As darkness falls, the surface water cools slightly. The animals that nautiluses scavenge from, crustaceans, fish, the remains of things that have died and begun to drift down, are more active in the dark, more likely to be moving through the water column. The shallower depths become, briefly, safer, and the Nautilus rises to meet all of this, ascending perhaps 100 or 150 meters over the course of a few hours, then descending again before the light returns. This is a daily migration, small by the standards of some ocean animals, which cross entire basins in seasonal movements. But for the Nautilus, it is a complete and reliable world. Up in the dark, down in the light. The slope is the stage, and the rhythm of depth is the script. There is something in this that is difficult to fully absorb. We think of migration as something that happens across vast distances. Birds crossing continents, whales crossing oceans. But here is an animal whose entire migration is vertical, measured not in thousands of kilometers, but in a few hundred meters of water. And yet, within that small column of ocean, almost everything that matters to the Nautilus is contained. Its food, its temperature, its safety, its rest. The whole of a life, arranged not across the face of the earth, but through its layers. The Indo-Pacific is where all of this takes place. The Nautilus's range is not global. It is concentrated in a broad arc from the Andaman Sea in the northwest through the Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and down toward Australia and Fiji in the south. Within that range, it is found wherever suitable reef slopes exist, places where the shallow reef drops away and the right combination of depth, temperature, and substrate appears. It is not rare exactly, but it is not common either. You would not encounter one casually. They are animals of the in-between, not in the shallows, not in the abyss, not in open ocean, but on the hidden slope between worlds. That position, between worlds, feels like the right way to think about the Nautilus in general. It is between the ancient and the modern, between the simple and the complex, between the familiar and the genuinely strange. And now, knowing something of its body and its shell and its senses, we can add between depths, between light and dark, between the warm surface and the cold floor. The shell makes this possible. The buoyancy system makes it manageable. The pinhole eye, the chemical senses, the dozens of soft chiri. All of these are tools for living in a world where depth is the primary dimension. Everything we have learned about the Nautilus in the sections before this one was preparation for understanding this. That the animal is precisely, beautifully, quietly suited to a vertical life, not by chance. By the long accumulation of what worked, generation after generation, in the dim and pressured water of the reef slope. The slope continues downward, past where the Nautilus goes, into darker and colder regions that belong to other animals entirely. The Nautilus does not follow. It has found its band, its corridor, its particular piece of the ocean's depth. And there, in the blue-grey quiet between the living reef and the distant floor, it drifts, patient, unhurried, neither rising nor falling for now, just hovering in the middle of its world, which is the middle of the sea. But anatomy is only the beginning of this story, because the Nautilus spends each day translating its design into motion. For most of the day, the Nautilus rests. It hangs at depth, somewhere between 200 and 400 meters below the surface, in water that is cold and very dark and still. The shell holds its position with the quiet precision that has been described in earlier sections. Gas and fluid balanced against each other, buoyancy calibrated to the pressure at that particular depth. The animal does not need to swim to stay in place. It simply exists there, settled into the water column the way a stone settles into sediment, except that the stone does not choose its depth, and the Nautilus, in its slow way, does. This is the resting phase. It lasts through most of the daylight hours, and it looks, from the outside, very much like nothing at all. Then the light changes. Not the light at 400 meters. There is no light at 400 meters, or so little that it cannot be said to change in any meaningful way. But at the surface, far above, the sun begins to lower. The water column shifts in ways that are subtle and measurable. Temperature gradients adjusting, the faint signal of dimming that travels down through layers of ocean as a change in pressure in chemistry, in the behavior of other organisms. The Nautilus does not see the sunset. It does not need to. The ocean tells it something has changed, and the Nautilus begins to rise. The ascent is slow. This cannot be emphasized enough. The Nautilus does not surge upward. It does not rocket through the water column the way a frightened fish might, or the way its distant cephalopod relatives, the squid, can jet through open ocean in a matter of seconds. The Nautilus rises the way a thought rises before sleep, gradually, without announcement, at its own pace and on its own terms. In a given night, a Nautilus might travel from its resting depth of 300 or 400 meters up to somewhere between 100 and 150 meters, occasionally shallower, depending on conditions and the particular slope of the reef it inhabits. That is a vertical journey of 200 meters or more, accomplished over the course of several hours. The math is quiet. The pace is somewhere around a meter per minute, give or take, which is not a number that inspires awe until you hold it in mind long enough to realize that a meter per minute is also a kind of patience most animals never practice. What drives the ascent is not speed, but chemistry. As it rises, the Nautilus moves through water that is increasingly rich in the scent of organic material, drifting down from shallower depths. Particles of decayed matter, the chemical traces of other animals, the faint signal of a meal somewhere above. Its cirri, trailing softly from the opening of the shell, are reading the water constantly. The ascent is not random. It follows gradients the way a river follows low ground, moving toward the concentrations of scent that indicate food, or the presence of other organisms, or simply the warmer, more active zone of the reef slope where the night's work happens. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The Nautilus navigates not by sight. Its pinhole eyes can detect light and dark and the rough direction of a dim glow, but cannot resolve the kind of detail that would allow it to spot a meal from a distance, but by smell, by touch, by the chemistry of the water moving past its body. The slope it has known for years, perhaps decades, is known to it as a landscape of scent and texture and pressure. It rises into that landscape each night the way a person might walk a familiar path in the dark, guided not by sight, but by the feel of the ground underfoot and the smell of the air changing around them. The reef slope at night is a different world from the reef slope by day. In daylight, the shallow zones are busy with fish, with predators, with the quick and the alert. Many of the animals that would find a slow-moving Nautilus interesting are active in those hours, and the Nautilus's depth during the day is partly a refuge from that activity. Darkness changes the calculation. The larger predators that hunt by sight become less effective. The zone between 100 and 200 meters, which would be a riskier place for the Nautilus in daylight, becomes more navigable in the dark, and so the Nautilus rises into that zone as night opens, moving through water that has grown quieter, if not entirely safe. There is something in this rhythm that mirrors other kinds of rhythms. The tide has its pulse, the seasons have their long turning. And the Nautilus has this, a daily vertical migration, up and down the same slope, following the same gradient of temperature and pressure and scent that it has followed since it was young. The ocean has a timetable, and the Nautilus keeps it faithfully. This kind of vertical migration is not unique to the Nautilus. Many organisms make daily journeys up and down the water column. Zooplankton, certain fish, various crustaceans. The deep scattering layer, a vast dispersed community of small animals, rises toward the surface at night and descends again before dawn in one of the largest coordinated movements of biomass on the planet. The Nautilus participates in a version of this ancient rhythm, though at a slower pace and a smaller scale. It is one thread in a pattern that runs through the whole ocean, from the tropics to the poles, from the surface to the abyss. What the Nautilus does at depth before its ascent, and what exactly triggers the moment of rising, is something researchers are still working to understand. The signal is likely a combination of factors. The gradual cooling that deepens through the day as surface heat disperses, the circadian rhythms built into the animal's own biology, the chemical cues rising from above as other organisms begin their own nocturnal movements. The Nautilus does not decide to rise in any way that resembles decision-making as we usually imagine it. And yet, it rises, reliably, night after night, in a rhythm so consistent that researchers tracking tagged animals can predict, within a reasonable window, when a given Nautilus will begin its ascent. There is something to notice here about the relationship between design and behavior. The chambered shell, the siphuncle, the buoyancy system. All of that structure exists, in part, to make this nightly movement possible. An animal that had to swim actively to maintain its depth would spend enormous energy simply staying in place, let alone traveling 200 meters upward and then back down again. The Nautilus's design offloads that work onto the shell. The shell holds the position, the shell manages the depth. And so the Nautilus can afford to be slow, can afford to spend its energy on the careful investigation of the slope, rather than on the raw mechanics of staying afloat. The form makes the behavior possible. The behavior gives the form its meaning. As the night deepens, the Nautilus moves across the slope, not just vertically, but laterally, following the contours of the reef, touching stone and sand with its trailing cirri, pausing at promising textures, hovering near crevices where organic material accumulates. The movement is unhurried enough that it can be difficult to watch and feel certain that movement is happening at all. The Nautilus does not rush toward anything. It investigates. It samples. It waits in the patient way of an animal that has no reason to hurry because the slope will still be there and the scent will still be there, and there is always more night ahead. Then, sometime before dawn, the process reverses. The light at the surface begins to return, still invisible at depth, still impossible to see directly, but signaled again by the same gradual chemistry, the same slow shift in the behavior of the water column. The Nautilus begins to descend. It sinks back toward the deeper, colder, darker water where it will rest through another day. The ascent and the descent together make a shape, a long, slow arc, up and then down, traced against the face of the reef slope in the dark. There is no drama in this. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Nautilus's daily life. The nightly ascent is not a hunt. It is not a chase. It is not a migration in the grand sense that word is sometimes used for animals crossing oceans or continents. It is a routine, a quiet, faithful, endlessly repeated routine that the Nautilus has been following in one form or another for its entire life, and that Nautiluses have been following in one form or another for an almost incomprehensible span of geological time. The slope receives it each night. The slope releases it each morning. The darkness comes and the Nautilus rises. The light comes and the Nautilus descends. The ocean turns on its axis, and the Nautilus turns with it, patient and unhurried, keeping its own version of the ocean's long timetable. By the time the Nautilus settles back into its resting depth, the water above it is already beginning to warm again with the new day's light. The reef slope continues its work, as it always does. The Nautilus tucks into the cold and the quiet and the dark, and rests, and waits for the next evening to begin its slow and steady rise all over again. Some rhythms do not need to be dramatic to be profound. Some things endure precisely because they are quiet and reliable and ask very little of the world except that it continue turning. And once we begin to follow its movements, we can ask the quieter question of what those movements are for. The Nautilus rises through the dark, as we have seen. It follows the slope upward, patient and unhurried, carried by its own buoyancy into shallower water as the reef above it slowly quiets. But ascent is not the goal. Ascent is only the beginning of something else. The real work of the night is quieter and slower than even that careful climb. It is the work of finding food in a world where almost nothing can be clearly seen. That work begins with chemistry. Long before the Nautilus reaches anything worth investigating, it knows the water has changed. Not through sight. Its pinhole eyes, open to the dim current without a lens to sharpen anything, cannot resolve the shapes of things at any useful distance. Not through hearing in any way we would recognize. What the Nautilus senses first, and most deeply, is scent. Or something close enough to scent that the word will serve, even if the experience is entirely its own. The Kiri, those dozens of slender, retractable extensions that emerge from the opening of the shell, are not only for touching. They are lined with chemoreceptors, cells that detect dissolved molecules in the water. When something edible has been nearby, it leaves a trace in the current, a faint chemical signature dispersing slowly through the dark. The Nautilus reads that signature the way a reader follows a sentence, one word at a time, in sequence, moving toward meaning. That is why it moves the way it does. Not in straight lines, not in the direct, efficient paths of an animal that can see its destination. It moves in gradual arcs, adjusting as the signal strengthens or fades, following the gradient of scent the way water follows the gradient of a slope. The path is curved because the information is curved. The search looks unhurried because it is. There is no point in rushing towards something you are only beginning to locate. What the Nautilus is most often searching for is not prey in the active sense. It is not hunting the way a shark hunts, or even the way an octopus hunts, with strategy, with concealment, with a decisive final movement. The Nautilus is, in the main, a scavenger. It is drawn to things already still. Molted shells, the remains of crustaceans, organic material that has settled into the crevices of the reef slope, rich with the chemical traces of what it once was. The Nautilus does not need to outmaneuver anything. It needs only to find what the ocean has already set down. There is something deeply restful in that way of living. The reef produces an enormous amount of material that is no longer living. Shed exoskeletons, fallen fragments, the soft remains of animals that have completed their lives. Most ecosystems depend on creatures willing to process that material, to return it to the cycle. The Nautilus is one of those creatures. Patient, thorough, unhurried. Moving through the dark and doing work that is easy to overlook but quietly necessary. When the scent trail leads somewhere promising, the Kiri extend further. They touch surfaces. They press gently against rock and rubble, sampling the texture and chemistry of whatever is there, building a picture of the immediate environment through contact rather than sight. The Siri can grip lightly, can probe narrow spaces, can distinguish between surfaces that offer something and surfaces that do not. In a world of dim shapes and soft edges, touch becomes a kind of seeing. The beak, hidden at the center of the ring of Kiri, is small and precisely formed, capable of breaking through the hard materials the Nautilus most often encounters. But this is not a violent process. It is methodical. The Nautilus does not tear or thrash. It works at things the way something patient works at anything, steadily, without wasted effort, until the task is done. And then it moves on. The trail continues. The night is long. What makes this approach to feeding so worth contemplating is how well it matches the world the Nautilus actually inhabits. Deep reef slopes in the middle depths where the Nautilus spends most of its life are not places of abundance in the way that shallow reef flats are. Light does not reach here in useful quantities. Photosynthesis does not happen. The energy that sustains life at these depths arrives from above, slowly, in the form of things that have died and drifted down. The Nautilus is adapted not for a world of plenty, but for a world of patient opportunity. It moves through a landscape where meals are scattered and irregular, and it has the metabolism to match. Slow burning, efficient, capable of going long periods without feeding at all. That metabolic patience is connected to everything else about the Nautilus. The slow heart, the low-pressure circulatory system, the cool water it prefers, which slows chemical reactions throughout its body and reduces the rate at which it needs to consume energy. A Nautilus in cold, dim water is a machine running at its most efficient setting. It does not need much, and the world it lives in does not offer much, and those two facts have found a kind of equilibrium across a very long time. Occasionally, the search leads to something more substantial. Crustaceans are a significant part of the Nautilus's diet when they can be found, not chased, but encountered. A molting crab, temporarily soft and unable to flee. A shrimp resting against a rock face. These encounters are not dramatic. They are simply moments when the gradient of scent leads to something that can be taken, and the Kiri do their work, and the beak does its work, and the Nautilus continues. No chase, no ambush, no theater. Just contact and investigation, and the quiet work of staying alive. The Kiri themselves are worth pausing with for a moment. There are up to 90 of them, depending on the individual. Slender, pale, capable of independent movement, each one gathering information and sending it back to the Nautilus's central processing. Unlike the arms of an octopus, which are long and strong and capable of complex manipulation, the Kiri of a Nautilus are delicate instruments, suited more for sensing than for force. They are the antenna of a world that communicates in chemistry and texture rather than in light and shape. To watch a Nautilus extend its cirri into a crevice is to watch something feel its way through a world that its eyes cannot fully translate. It is intimate in a way that is hard to articulate. A creature making contact with its world one small touch at a time. And the world makes contact back. The current carries information. The substrate holds chemical memory of what has passed across it. Even the temperature of the water shifts as the Nautilus moves along the slope, and those shifts carry meaning. Warmer water near a crevice might indicate biological activity, a concentration of life, something worth investigating. The Nautilus exists within a web of gradients, and it reads that web with its whole body, not just its eyes. This is, in a sense, a very different kind of intelligence than the kind we tend to celebrate. We admire the octopus for its problem-solving, its ability to learn and adapt and surprise. The Nautilus does not do those things in the same way. It does not open jars. It does not learn to navigate mazes with particular speed. Its nervous system is simpler, its responses less plastic, its behavior more fixed in the patterns that have served its lineage across hundreds of millions of years. And yet, it is not simple. It is finely tuned. Its chemical sensing is exquisitely sensitive. Its ability to follow a scent gradient through a moving current is a form of precision that is easy to underestimate because it looks, from the outside, like aimless drifting. It is not aimless. It is purposeful in a way that does not announce itself. That is a different thing entirely. As the night continues, the Nautilus works its way along the slope in this fashion, touching, tasting, adjusting, moving. There is no urgency in it. The cirri extend and retract. The shell tilts slightly as buoyancy is managed, as the animal adjusts its position relative to the substrate. The jet of water from the hyponome produces small, precise corrections in direction. Everything is measured. Everything is slow. The darkness around the Nautilus is complete, or nearly so, and it moves through that darkness the way something moves when it is entirely at home in where it is. Toward the later hours of the night, after feeding has run its course, the Nautilus begins to drift differently. The active probing slows. The cirri retract more fully. The animal hovers for a while in the mid-water, neither ascending nor descending, held in place by the balance of its chambers. It is not searching now. It is simply present, suspended in the dark water, shell tilted at a slight angle, the current moving past it without disturbing much. There is a quality to this hovering that is worth sitting with. The Nautilus is not resting in the way we rest, most likely. Its nervous system does not have the architecture for sleep as we understand it. But there is something in the stillness of this hovering that resembles rest in its function. A pause in active engagement with the world, a period of low demand, of simply being held in the water and carried slightly by whatever current is moving through the dark. The work is done for now. The shell is still. The water is cold and quiet around it. The reef slope continues above and below, doing its own slow work as it always does. The Nautilus is part of that work, and it is enough, and it continues, and the night moves on. Its search for food is quiet, and so is much of the rest of its life, shaped less by company than by time. The Nautilus does not gather. It does not form pods or schools or seasonal aggregations. If two Nautiluses cross the same stretch of reef slope on the same night, they do not acknowledge each other in any way we have been able to detect. They pass in the dark, each enclosed in its spiral, each following its own gradient of scent and pressure. And then they are gone from each other's world as quietly as they arrived in it. This is not loneliness. It is simply the shape of a life that does not require others to be complete. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Most of the animals we tend to think of as intelligent, the ones we study, the ones we feel kinship with, are social in some way. They have companions, rivals, families. They read each other's signals. They change in response to being watched. The Nautilus does none of this in any obvious sense. And yet, it is not simple. It is not absent. It is just organized around a different set of needs, a different economy of energy and time, one that has worked without revision for a very long while. What that life looks like from the inside is something we can only approach from the edges. But what we can observe tells us something about what it means to live slowly, to live alone, and to live long. Nautiluses are among the slowest maturing cephalopods known. An octopus may hatch, grow, reproduce, and die within a single year. Some squid live only months. The Nautilus takes years, often many years, to reach sexual maturity. Estimates vary, but the most careful studies suggest somewhere between 5 and 15 years before an individual is ready to reproduce, depending on conditions, temperature, and depth. For a soft-bodied animal in an ocean full of predators, that is an extraordinary commitment of time. It is a wager. The animal must survive long enough, through years of nightly ascents and descents, through years of searching in darkness, before it contributes anything to the next generation. That wager is part of why the Nautilus is considered vulnerable in ways that faster reproducing animals are not. A population of octopuses can recover quickly because generations turn over quickly. A population of Nautiluses, thinned by pressure, takes much longer to rebuild. The slow pace of maturation, which is one of the animal's defining traits, is also one of its quiet risks. When reproduction does come, it comes without ceremony. There are no dramatic displays. No color changes rippling across the skin. No elaborate posturing or competition that we have observed. The Nautilus does not have the chromatophores that allow octopuses and cuttlefish to perform. Its hood is pale and patterned, but it is not a billboard. Whatever communication happens between nautiluses during mating is subtle enough that we have rarely witnessed it clearly. The animals find each other in the dark, in the deep, and what passes between them is private in the way that most of what the Nautilus does is private. After mating, the female lays eggs, not many. This, too, is part of the Nautilus's slow logic. Where many marine animals produce thousands or millions of eggs, small, numerous, expendable, the Nautilus produces only a few dozen at most, sometimes far fewer. Each egg is large by cephalopod standards. Each is encased in a tough, leathery capsule and attached to hard substrate on the reef, a rock face, a ledge, a firm surface in shallow, warmer water. The female does not guard them. She lays them and moves on, returning to her own life in the dim slope below. There is something in that image worth holding. The eggs rest on the rock, alone in the shallows, each one containing the full beginning of a nautilus. The soft body, the coiled beginning of a shell, everything that will eventually become an animal capable of navigating depth by adjusting the gas in its chambers. All of that, waiting in a capsule smaller than a thumb. The patience required is not the mother's. It is the egg's own, a stillness that can last months before anything emerges. When the young nautilus finally hatches, it is already complete in its basic form. It does not pass through a larval stage the way many marine animals do, drifting as plankton through open water. It hatches as a small but recognizable nautilus, its shell already coiled and chambered, its tiri already present, its buoyancy system already functional in its early way. It is ready, from the first moment, to begin living the life of a nautilus, small, alone, and already equipped. That independence is immediate and total. There is no parent to follow, no pod to join, no guidance of any kind. The young Nautilus descends from the shallow hatching site into deeper water and begins. Everything it needs to know about hunting, about ascending, about adjusting its buoyancy, about sensing chemical trails in dark water, all of it is already present, written into the body rather than learned from others. The Nautilus is, in this sense, self-contained from the very beginning. It arrives in the world already knowing how to be what it is. There is something quietly remarkable about that. We tend to think of intelligence and complexity as things that require teaching, that require time spent in the company of those who already know. But the Nautilus carries its knowledge differently. It is not cultural, it is not transmitted. It is structural, embedded in a nervous system and a body plan that has been refined over an immense span of time. The young Nautilus does not need to be taught to be a Nautilus. It simply is one. As it grows, the shell grows with it, adding chambers in the spiral pattern we have already spent time with. Each chamber sealed, each one a record of an earlier, smaller self. The animal moves forward, always living in the newest and outermost room, always pulling its past behind it in the form of hollow architecture. Over years, the shell lengthens and widens, the spiral deepens. The animal inside it grows heavier, more practiced, more settled into the rhythms of the slope. And somewhere in those years, the Nautilus becomes part of what the reef slope depends on. Not dramatically, not in any way that announces itself. But the Nautilus moves through the system in ways that matter, quietly and over time. Its nightly ascents carry it from the deep into shallower water and back again. As it moves, it passes through different layers of the water column, and what it carries with it, the chemistry of its body, the material it processes and releases, crosses those layers too. This kind of vertical movement links depths that would otherwise be more isolated from each other. The Nautilus is not the only animal doing this, but it is one of them, and the cumulative effect of many animals making those same crossings over many years is a kind of circulation, a slow mixing of the slope's resources. When it feeds on the dead and dying, the fallen crustaceans, the soft remains of other animals, it participates in the reef's recycling. Nothing in a system like this is wasted for long. What falls is found. What is consumed becomes something else. The Nautilus takes what the slope offers and, in processing it, returns something to the water around it. This is not a grand ecological drama. It is simply the quiet arithmetic of a working system, each participant doing its small part, the whole remaining coherent because enough of those parts are always in motion. And then, eventually, the Nautilus rests. Drifting back to depth as the light returns, settling into the cooler, darker water where pressure and temperature hold it still. The shell that has been growing for years hangs in the water column, neutrally buoyant, the animal inside it motionless. The cirri are retracted. The hood is closed. The current moves past without disturbing anything. This is the pace of a Nautilus life. Long preparation, quiet reproduction, independent young. Years of slow movement through a vertical world. No audience, no performance, no social architecture to maintain. Just the animal and the dark water and the accumulated chambers of a shell that keeps growing, keeps recording, keeps carrying everything the animal has ever been. It is easy to read absence into a life like this. to see the solitude as emptiness, the silence as lack. But that is our frame, not the Nautilus's. The Nautilus does not experience its life as sparse. It experiences whatever it experiences. The chemical trail in the water, the texture of stone beneath its cirri, the slow change of pressure as it rises, fully in the way that any creature experiences its own existence. The world it moves through is not a reduced world. It is simply a different one, measured in gradients and depth rather than in faces and voices. There is something restful in that, considered from a distance. A life that does not require constant calibration to others. A life governed by older, quieter signals. The Nautilus does not need to be understood by other Nautiluses to live well. It does not need to explain itself or be seen or find its place in a hierarchy. It moves through the dark water, it finds what it needs, and it continues. And somewhere on a reef slope in the Indo-Pacific, in water that is cool and dim and very still, a Nautilus is doing exactly that right now. Rising slowly as the light fades, following a scent that leads towards something worth investigating. Its shell hanging around it, chambered and patient, older in its design than almost anything else in the water. The animal inside it, quiet and complete, doing what Nautiluses have always done, in the way they have always done it, for longer than we can easily imagine. The slope holds it, the dark holds it, and the night continues. And because its way of living is so patient, the Nautilus invites us into a much slower scale of thought. Not the slow scale of a single night on the reef slope, or even a single lifetime. Something much longer than that. Something that requires the mind to release its grip on the familiar and drift backward. Through centuries, through millennia, through spans of time so large that the word ancient begins to feel insufficient. The Nautilus belongs to a lineage of shelled cephalopods that reaches back more than 500 million years. That number is difficult to hold. It helps, perhaps, to consider what it contains. The dinosaurs arose and vanished within the last 250 million years of it. The Atlantic Ocean, as a body of water, is younger than that. The Himalayas are younger than that. The Nautilus lineage predates all of it, moving through seas that no longer exist, over sea floors that have since become mountain ranges, beneath skies that held no birds and no familiar stars. And yet, the shell remained. The basic logic of it, chambered, spiral, buoyant, remained. That is not a small thing to sit with. The earliest shelled cephalopods were not Nautiluses. They were something older and stranger, long conical creatures with chambered shells that pointed in a straight line rather than curling into a spiral. They drifted in shallow seas during the Ordovician period, in an ocean whose coastlines bear no resemblance to any map we have ever drawn. Over time, some lineages developed curved shells, then tightly coiled ones. The spiral was not a sudden invention. It was a slow discovery, arrived at across immense stretches of time, refined by the logic of what worked. What makes this worth dwelling on is not the timeline alone. It is what the timeline implies about survival. A design principle does not persist for 500 million years by accident. It persists because it keeps being useful in different seas, at different temperatures, against different pressures and predators and conditions. The chambered shell was useful in the Ordovician. It was useful in the Silurian. It was useful in the Devonian. And it is useful now in in the same dark water at the same quiet depths, in the same patient way. Life rarely holds on to anything that long unless it is genuinely, repeatedly, deeply right. Among the most successful inheritors of this design were the ammonites. They were extraordinary. For roughly 340 million years, ammonites diversified into thousands of species, some with shells the size of a human hand, some larger than a wagon wheel, some with elaborate ridges and ornate surface textures that suggest a kind of extravagance we rarely associate with animals that lived in the open ocean. They were everywhere. They were abundant. They left behind so many fossils that a person can find ammonite impressions in limestone walls, in riverbanks, in cliffs along coasts that were once sea floors. And then they were gone. The extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous period, the same one that ended the non-avian dinosaurs, took the ammonites entirely. Whatever made them so successful, whatever particular combination of biology and behavior had allowed them to thrive for so long, was not enough when the sky darkened and the ocean chemistry shifted and the world reorganized itself around a sudden catastrophe. The Nautilus lineage survived. It is not entirely clear why. The Nautilus's deep-water habitat may have offered some shelter from the disruptions that devastated shallower seas. Its ability to scavenge rather than hunt living prey may have made it more flexible during periods when food webs collapsed. Its slow metabolism, its patient biology, its willingness to wait. Perhaps all of these things offered a kind of resilience that faster, more specialized animals could not access. Yet the Nautilus is not presented honestly if it is called simply a survivor. Survival, as a word, undersells what this lineage has actually done. It has not merely endured. It has continued to be a fully functioning, finely calibrated participant in the ocean for 500 million years. It has continued to grow its precise shell, to manage its chambers, to descend and ascend the reef slope, to sense the water for traces of what has drifted past. It has not been waiting for something. It has been living. There is a tendency, when we encounter very old lineages, to call them primitive. The word carries a sense of incompleteness, as though these animals are drafts of something that was later corrected. But the Nautilus is not a draft. It is not an unfinished version of the octopus or the squid. It is a different answer to the same broad questions: how to move, how to feed, how to regulate depth, how to persist. And it is an answer that has proven itself across a span of time that makes most of what we consider ancient look recent. The octopus, for all its extraordinary intelligence and behavioral flexibility, has existed in roughly its current form for perhaps 90 million years. The Nautilus lineage is 5 times older than that. What the Nautilus carries, then, is not obsolescence. It is continuity. It is the living expression of a design logic that has been tested against more versions of this planet than we can easily imagine. Warmer oceans and cooler ones, higher seas and lower ones, different configurations of land and water, different communities of predators and prey. And each time, the chambered shell, the siphuncle, the slow vertical movement, the patient chemistry, each time these things were enough. There is something quietly remarkable about an animal whose existence spans the entire history of complex animal life on Earth. When the first vertebrates were learning to breathe air and haul themselves onto muddy shorelines, nautiluses were already ancient. When the first forests rose and the first insects took flight, nautiluses were already ancient. When the continents we recognize began to take their current shapes, nautiluses were already ancient. They did not witness these events in any way we would call witnessing. But they were present in the ocean, continuing. The ocean changed around them. The world changed around them. And the spiral shell continued to grow, chamber by chamber, in the same patient way. That is a kind of endurance that has no good human equivalent. We do not have language for it that feels adequate. We reach for words like ancient and survivor, and they are not wrong exactly, but they are small against the actual scale of what they are trying to describe. Perhaps that is the most honest place to leave it. Some things are too old to be fully held by the mind. They can only be approached, circled the way the shell itself spirals, getting closer without ever quite arriving at the center. The Nautilus does not know it is old. It does not carry its history as a burden or a distinction. It moves through the dark water with the same unhurried attention it has always moved with, following the same gradients, managing the same chambers, sensing the same faint traces of what the ocean carries past. It is simply itself, as it has always been, and that, in the longest possible view, is enough. To think about the Nautilus for long is also to wonder what the world feels like from inside such a different arrangement of senses. Not to know. Knowing is not available to us here. But to wonder, carefully, without forcing an answer, is something we can do, and it is worth doing slowly. The Nautilus has eyes, that much is certain. 2 of them, one on either side of the head, positioned to take in the water on both sides as it moves. But those eyes do not work the way ours do. There is no lens inside them, no curved surface to bend and focus light into sharpness. Instead, there is only a small opening, a pinhole, through which light enters directly, falling onto the retina without any clarifying structure to organize it first. What arrives is dim, diffuse, softened at every edge. We know what a pinhole camera produces. The image is real. It is not nothing. But it lacks contrast, lacks crispness, lacks the clean boundaries that a lens would draw around every shape. Things that a lens-bearing eye would separate into distinct objects may arrive at a pinhole eye as gradients, as darker and lighter, as something present rather than something defined. That is a different kind of seeing. Not worse, necessarily. Different. The Nautilus does not need to read the fine details of a distant face or track a fast-moving target across open water. It lives in a world of slow pressure and gradual change, where the most important information tends to arrive not as a sharp image, but as a shift in the quality of the surrounding dark. Brighter means shallower. Dimmer means deeper. The glow above is the direction of the surface. The darkness below is the direction of the slope. These are the large facts of the Nautilus's visual world, and a pinhole eye can carry them adequately. What it cannot carry, perhaps, is the sense of a world made of edges. Our minds are shaped by edges. We see where one thing ends and another begins. We read faces by the boundaries of features. We navigate by the outlines of objects. So much of what we call perception is really the detection of contrast, of borders, of the places where light changes abruptly. A world seen through a pinhole may be a world where those borders soften, where one thing blurs into the next, where the reef slope is not a collection of distinct objects, but a shifting field of texture and tone. There is something restful in imagining that, a world without hard edges, a world known by gradients. The Nautilus moves through dim water, and what it receives is not a picture so much as a feeling of the light, its direction, its intensity, its slow dimming as depth increases. That may be enough. That may be exactly enough for the life it lives. But vision is not where the Nautilus gathers most of its world. Chemistry is. The Curie, those many slender appendages, dozens of them, extending from the center of the animal outward into the water, are not only used for touching and holding. They carry receptors that sense dissolved molecules, chemicals that drift from food, from living things, from the surfaces of rock and coral and sediment. The Nautilus extends these cirri the way we might close our eyes and simply breathe, taking in what is present without having to look at it. Scent is perhaps too simple a word for what this is. In water, chemical information spreads differently than it does in air. It travels in plumes and gradients, shaped by currents, dispersing slowly outward from its source. A piece of food on the seafloor releases molecules that drift upward and sideways through the column of water. The Nautilus, moving through that same water, encounters the gradient, stronger here, weaker there, and follows it. Not by deciding to follow it in the way we might consciously choose a direction, but by moving in the way that brings the signal closer, the way a hand moves without instruction towards something warm. This is knowing through contact, through immersion, through being inside the information rather than looking at it from a distance. We tend to think of intelligence as something that stands apart from the world and examines it. We picture a mind that receives information, processes it, and then acts. But the Nautilus suggests a different arrangement, one where the boundary between the animal and its environment is more porous. The world arrives through touch and chemistry, through the feeling of pressure and current and temperature. The animal and the ocean are in continuous conversation, conducted in the language of gradient and contact, rather than image and symbol. What does it mean to know something that way? We can only approach the question obliquely. We have our own moments of gradient knowing. The way the body registers a change in air temperature before the mind has named it. The way a smell can carry information that arrives faster than thought. The way the skin knows pressure and texture in ways that the visual mind sometimes misses entirely. These are not our primary ways of knowing, but they are there. For the Nautilus, they may be primary. The eyes are present, but they offer only the broadest strokes. The Curie are their instruments of fine attention. The animal that seems to us to be navigating in near blindness may in fact be reading the water with extraordinary precision, just in a register we have no direct access to. And then there is the shell itself. The shell is not a sense organ in any conventional way, but it is a kind of instrument. It mediates the Nautilus's relationship with pressure, with depth, with the physical weight of the water column above. The siphuncle, running through every chamber, is continuously in conversation with that pressure, responding to it, adjusting to it, maintaining the animal at the depth where it belongs. The body is always listening to the ocean through the shell, even if that listening happens below the level of what we would call awareness. A body that is always in dialogue with its environment, always adjusting, always in the middle of a slow negotiation between inside and outside. That is not so different from what any body does. We breathe in response to carbon dioxide levels we never consciously measure. Our pupils open and close as light changes without instruction. The body is always reading the world in ways the thinking mind never sees. The Nautilus simply makes this more visible. The chambers, the siphuncle, the chiri extended into the water. These are all instruments of a continuous conversation with the surrounding ocean. The animal is not separate from its world. It is made of responses to it. Whether any of this rises to something we would recognize as experience, that we cannot say. The question of what it is like to be a Nautilus is genuinely open, and it will likely remain open. The Nautilus has no way to tell us, and we have no way to step inside a body so differently arranged and feel what it feels. But the question itself is worth sitting with, because asking it changes something. It asks us to hold our own way of perceiving the world a little more lightly, to remember that seeing in sharp focus, dividing the world into named and bounded objects, tracking fast motion across a bright field, these are one way of knowing, a very particular way, shaped by the eyes we have, the nervous system we carry, the world our ancestors moved through. There are other ways, slower ways, ways that work by immersion and gradient and patient chemical reading, ways that have been sufficient for hundreds of millions of years in the dim and pressured world below the reef. The Nautilus moves through that world right now, somewhere in the dark water of the Indo-Pacific. Its cirri are extended. It is reading the water. It is inside the information, not outside looking in. What it knows, we cannot know, but that it knows something in its own unhurried, gradient-following, chemically fluent way seems very likely. And that is enough to drift with quietly for a while. And perhaps that is why people have carried the Nautilus so easily into metaphor, seeing in its shell not only an animal, but a pattern that feels larger than one life. The spiral has done something to the human mind for a very long time. It appears in the oldest carvings we have found, scratched into stone by hands that never saw a Nautilus and perhaps never saw an ocean. It appears in temples, in textiles, in the margins of manuscripts. It seems to arrive naturally wherever people sit long enough to make marks. There is something in the coiled form that the eye wants to follow and the mind wants to hold. When people eventually encountered the Nautilus shell, cleaned, dried, carried inland by trade, the response was immediate and deep. Here was the spiral made by something living. Here was the abstract form given weight and surface and the faint smell of the sea. It seemed like evidence of something. It seemed like proof that the universe had a preference for this shape, that nature was writing in a language people had already been trying to read. That feeling is not wrong, exactly. It is just incomplete. Cabinets of curiosity collected Nautilus shells in the 16th and 17th centuries, alongside fossils, dried fish, and fragments of coral. They sat in the same wooden drawers as beetles pinned to card and seeds from unknown continents. The shell was treated as a specimen of wonder, and it was. But a wonder removed from context, removed from depth, removed from the animal that had built it over years of patient growth in dim water. What people held was a record. They did not always think about what it was a record of. Craftsmen mounted Nautilus shells in silver and gold, turning them into drinking vessels and decorative objects for wealthy households. The spiral was gilded. The chambers were sealed behind polished surfaces. The shell became an artifact of human meaning, beautiful and strange, admired for what it suggested rather than for what it was. In those settings, the Nautilus was no longer an animal. It had become an emblem. And then came the mathematics. When naturalists began measuring the shell carefully, they found that each chamber bore a consistent proportional relationship to the one before it. The spiral did not change its angle as it grew. The form expanded outward while remaining similar to itself at every scale. This is called equiangular growth, and it produces a curve of quiet precision. For centuries, it was associated with the golden ratio, with Fibonacci sequences, with a supposedly divine geometry threading through living things. The Nautilus shell became a popular illustration of this idea, appearing in textbooks and popular books about mathematics and beauty. The association is not quite accurate, as it turns out. The Nautilus spiral does not match the golden ratio as precisely as the popular story suggests. The measurements, when taken carefully, show something more variable and more interesting. A growth pattern that is consistent but not perfect, shaped by the real pressures of a body growing inside a shell, not by an abstract mathematical ideal. The shell is beautiful because it works, not because it is a theorem. That distinction matters, though it is easy to miss. The impulse to find perfect mathematics in living things comes from a genuine and generous place. It comes from the feeling that beauty and order must be connected, that form must have meaning, that something as elegant as a Nautilus shell cannot be merely functional. But function is not less than meaning. The shell is what it is, because it solved real problems across immense time. That is its own kind of wonder, and it does not require the shell to be a proof of anything. The Nautilus has been used as a symbol of growth, of resilience, of the journey inward and outward at once. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a poem about it in 1858, imagining the animal leaving each chamber behind as it grew, building nobler mansions as it went, and framing this as a model for the human soul. The poem is beautiful. It is also almost entirely about Holmes, not about the Nautilus. The animal in that poem is a costume. The spiral is borrowed to say something about aspiration and transcendence, and the desire to outgrow what once contained us. The actual Nautilus does not leave its chambers behind. It carries them. The shell is not a series of abandoned homes, but a continuous structure, a record of every stage of growth still present, still functional, still part of the animal's body. The old chambers are not left empty and forgotten. They are part of the buoyancy system, part of the architecture that allows this animal to hover in the water column at all. The past is not discarded. It is load-bearing. That is, in some ways, a more interesting idea than the poem's version. Not a soul-building ever nobler mansions. A life that carries everything it has ever been and uses it. There is something worth sitting with in the gap between what we want the Nautilus to mean and what it actually is. The desire to read the spiral as a symbol comes from real wonder. It comes from the genuine recognition that this form is remarkable, that it appears in places beyond the shell, that the universe does seem to have certain preferences. The feeling is not a mistake. But when we project our meanings too quickly onto a living thing, we stop seeing it. We see ourselves instead, reflected in a polished surface. Real wonder might be the willingness to let the Nautilus remain a Nautilus, to let the shell be a shell, calcified, chambered, ancient, functional, grown over years in dim water by an animal with dozens of soft arms and a pinhole eye, and a patience we can only approximate. To hold it without gilding it. To look at the spiral without immediately reaching for what it represents, and simply notice for a moment what it is. That is harder than it sounds. The mind wants to mean things. It wants the beautiful to point somewhere. It is not comfortable with beauty that simply exists. And yet, the Nautilus has been in these waters for a very long time. It was here before the poem. It was here before the cabinets of curiosity, before the silver mounts, before anyone measured its chambers and found them nearly but not perfectly proportional to a ratio that itself might say something about the universe. It was here, moving slowly up reef slopes in the dark, trailing its Siri through water that tasted of possibility, adjusting the fluid in its chambers by fractions, hovering. It did not know it was a symbol. It did not need to be. It simply continued. There is something settling about that. The Nautilus does not require our meaning to persist. It does not need to be an emblem of growth or a proof of divine geometry, or a metaphor for the soul's aspiration. It is already something more patient and more complete than any of those things. It is a living animal that has found a way to exist in a difficult and beautiful world, and has continued finding that way across stretches of time that make every human story very small. Let the spiral be a spiral. Let the shell be a shell. Let the animal be, for a moment, exactly what it is. Drifting in dark water, somewhere in the warm Pacific, doing its quiet and ancient work, needing nothing from us at all. That thought is a restful one, something that does not need to be held, something that continues without requiring witness. The Nautilus moves through its world the same way it always has, whether anyone is watching or not, whether anyone has given it meaning or not. It rises and descends. It senses the water. It carries its chambers. It is enough. It has always been enough. And now we stop knowing and simply become. The day is still. You are not. Something has shifted in the water around you, and your body knows it before you do. Not through sight. The light here is always dim, always blue-grey and uncertain, filtering down through hundreds of feet of ocean in a way that softens everything into gradients. You know the change through pressure, through the particular weight of the water against your shell. The cold has a different quality now. The slope has grown quiet in the way it grows quiet when the shallow world above begins to release the last of its warmth. And that is the signal. That is the beginning. You begin to rise. It is not a decision exactly. It is more like an inclination, the way a thought arrives already formed, already in motion. The chambers inside your shell are already calibrated, already holding their careful balance of gas and stillness, and the water around you gives way in small degrees as you lift away from the stone. Slowly, patiently. There is no urgency in this ascent. There is only the steady, ancient pull of upward. The reef slope passes beside you. You do not see it clearly. You have never seen anything clearly. The world comes to you as gradients of brightness, suggestions of shape. A darker mass where the wall of the slope rises, a paler wash where the open water spreads. Your eyes take in light the way a very still pool of water takes in the reflection of the sky, softly, approximately, without sharp edges. And that has always been enough. It has been enough for longer than you have any way to know. What you feel more precisely is the current, the slight, persistent movement of water against your shell, against the soft fringe of your chiri where they trail and drift. You feel the temperature shift as you ascend, a slow warming, then another cooling, the layers of the ocean making themselves known one by one. You pass through them, you register them. Your body does not name them, but it knows them. You rise, the slope continues beside you, in the dark, vast and patient. There are things living in the crevices there. You have passed this way before, many times, in a life spent moving vertically through the same familiar column of water. You know the contours of this slope, the way you know the chambers inside your shell, not by thinking about them, but by having moved through them for so long that they have become part of what you are. The slope is not separate from you. It is where you live. It is the world. Higher now. The water is slightly warmer, slightly brighter, though bright is a relative word here, and even the surface, far above, would seem dim to an eye built differently than yours. What you have is sufficient. What you have is ancient and sufficient, and it carries you through the dark. Your tsiri move without your asking them to. They trail and sift and taste the water as you pass through it. There is something here, a faint chemical thread, distant and dissolving, the kind of trace that means something has passed this way, something that once was alive and is now slowly becoming part of the water. You follow it without haste. You are not hunting urgently. You are investigating the way a careful and unhurried creature investigates, by moving toward, by touching, by tasting, by knowing. The trace leads you along the slope. Your tsiri reach toward a ledge and find it before your eyes resolve it. Cold stone. The particular roughness of something encrusted, something small and living in the rock. You know this surface through your arms before you know anything else about it. The world arrives in your tsiri first, always first. You spend time here. Time is not something you measure or spend with any urgency. It simply passes, and you move through it the way you move through water. Slowly, without resistance, without needing to arrive anywhere in particular. You investigate the ledge. You find what is there. You take what you need, in the quiet and methodical way of an animal that has never needed to be fast, that has survived this long precisely because it learned the value of patience over speed. Your shell carries you. It has always carried you. The spiral of it, the inner architecture you cannot see but can always feel. The weight of it, the balance of it, the way it holds you in the water at precisely the depth you need to be. Each chamber sealed behind you as you grew, each one a room you vacated and left full of the quiet gas that keeps you aloft. You carry your whole past inside you, chambered and still. And the shell holds all of it without effort, the way it has always held everything, lightly, precisely, by design. The slope grows quieter as the night deepens. The things that move in darkness are moving, but they are not moving loudly. The water carries sound in long, slow waves, and the sounds you receive are distant and soft. The creak and shift of the living reef, the faint percussion of things settling, things drifting, things continuing their own quiet work. You are part of this. You have always been part of this. One more body moving through the dark water, following its own unhurried timetable, asking nothing of the night except that it continue. You drift a little. The current moves you sideways along the slope, and you let it. Your shell adjusts, not through any action you take, but through the slow and patient exchange that is always happening inside you. The delicate system of pressure and fluid that keeps you at your depth without your having to think about it. You are held by your own interior. You are balanced from within. The slope curves here, and you follow the curve. The world is darker now, or perhaps you have simply grown more settled into the dark, more at home in it. This is your hour. This is always your hour. The deep blue of the water in true night, the cold that is not unpleasant but simply present, the weight of the ocean above you pressing down in a way that has always felt, to you, like nothing more than the ordinary weight of being in the world. You are not alone on this slope, but you are solitary. There is a difference. Other things are moving somewhere in this same dark water, going about their own lives without reference to yours. You do not seek them out. You do not need them near. Your life has always been a largely interior one, spent inside your shell, inside your depth, inside the quiet routines of ascent and descent, of investigation and rest. You are not lonely. You are simply yourself, in the way that a very old kind of creature is simply itself, without needing to be anything more. The night is long. You move through it steadily. At some point, the hunting is finished. The investigation of the slope gives way to something quieter, something that is not quite stillness, but is moving toward it. Your chiri slow their searching. The current carries you gently. The chambers of your shell hold their balance, and the balance holds you. And the water holds everything with the same indifferent generosity it has always shown. You begin to descend, not because you have decided to, because the quality of the water is changing again, because some register deep in your body knows that the dark is beginning to thin above you. Not into light exactly, not yet, but into the first grey suggestion of light, the earliest softening of the deep blue that means the surface world is waking. And your body knows, the way it has always known, that the slope is safer now. That depth is where you belong when the day returns. You sink slowly. The slope rises beside you as you go down. The water cools. The pressure increases in a way that is not uncomfortable. It is simply the feeling of being at your proper depth, the feeling of being where you are supposed to be. The chambers adjust. The siphuncle does its slow and patient work. You descend through the familiar layers of the ocean, each one slightly different from the last, each one registered and recognized and accepted. The wall of the slope is close. You can feel it in the way the current changes near stone. You reach toward it with a few of your chiri and find it. The familiar roughness, the texture of the deep reef, cold and still and covered in the quiet life that covers every surface down here. You settle against it, not quite resting, simply slowing. The water is very still. Your chira drift loose and easy, no longer searching. Your shell is balanced. The chambers inside you hold their gas, their patient emptiness, their record of every size you have ever been. The spiral of you is complete for this moment, this depth, this particular still point in the long story of your life on this slope. The grey above you is growing, slowly, distantly. You do not move toward it. You are here in the deep and familiar dark. The slope is quiet. The water is quiet. The thing that moves inside you, the pulse of it, the slow rhythm of a body that has been moving through this ocean for a very long time, settles into something slower still. Your chiri are still. Your shell holds you. The water holds your shell. And you are still, and the slope is still, and the deep blue dark of the deep reef presses in around you, gently, evenly from every side. And there is nothing required of you now, nothing to investigate, nothing to follow. The night has given what it gives, and the day is not yet asking anything. There is only this: the weight of the water, the balance of the shell, the long and patient dark. Still, held, enough. From here, there is almost nowhere else to go except into stillness. You have spent a long time with this animal, with its spiral and its chambers and the slow chemistry of its buoyancy, with its patient Siri moving through dark water, with the nightly rise and the quiet return to depth. You have been inside its world, in a way, not completely, not the way it knows its own world, but enough to feel the shape of it. What remains is not a fact. It is something quieter than that. The Nautilus has been making the same shell for a very long time. Not the same individual shell, but the same form, the same proportions, the same elegant answer to the question of how to live soft-bodied in a pressured world. That form has passed through hundreds of millions of years of changing ocean, changing climate, changing everything. And it has arrived here, tonight, still turning slowly in dim water somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, still adding chambers, still managing its depth in the dark. There is something in that which does not need to be explained. It only needs to be felt. Let your jaw be soft now. Let it release the last of whatever it was holding. Your hands, wherever they are resting, let them open a little or stay as they are, loose and unheld. Your body has been here, in this stillness, for some time now. It knows what it needs. It is already doing it. The shell is a spiral, and a spiral has no sharp edges. It curves into itself. It does not arrive at a point. It simply continues, each turn wider than the last, until the animal outgrows it and adds another room, and the whole shape expands. Gently, gradually, without urgency. That is a kind of patience that is hard to name. You do not need to name it. You have already spent the night with it. You have already felt, in some dim and drifting way, what it means to move slowly through a dark world and find it enough. To be guided by scent and pressure and the faint difference between warmer water and colder. To carry your history inside you, sealed and quiet, in chambers you no longer enter. The Nautilus does not know it is ancient. It does not know it has outlasted nearly everything. It only knows the dark slope and the scent of something drifting down from above and the slow adjustment of depth. That is its whole world, and that world is enough. Your eyes are heavy. Let them be heavy. There is nothing they need to find. Somewhere, in water that is dim and cold and very far away, the Nautilus is doing what it has always done. Drifting, adjusting, settling toward the depth where the temperature is right and the pressure holds it gently in place. It is not thinking about the length of its lineage, or the beauty of its shell, or what it means to have survived so much. It is simply there, patient, continuing, and you are here, still. In the quiet dark of wherever you are, the water is deep, the shell turns slowly. Everything that needed to be said has been said. Sleep well and good night.